Walker stole from me before she filed for divorce. My ex-husband's voice echoed through the community center just as our high school reunion committee called everyone to the stage for the class photograph. Conversation stopped. A woman dropped her fork onto a paper plate. Even the ceiling fan overhead seemed louder as 50 classmates turned to stare at me. I stood near the table of family photographs, gripping a cup of sweet tea while Daniel Walker, my husband of 43, years and my ex-husband for 8, held a yellowed document above his head like evidence in a courtroom. "I kept quiet all these years," he said into the microphone, shaking his head for effect. "But folks deserve to know the truth." I looked around the room. Some people avoided my eyes. Others leaned forward in their chairs, hungry for gossip after all these years. Daniel had always known how to work a crowd. Back in 1974, he was the handsome football captain everyone admired. At 68, the gray in his beard and the lines around his eyes had changed him, but not nearly as much as life had changed me. 8 years earlier, when our marriage collapsed, most people in our little Tennessee town assumed I'd never recover. Daniel owned the construction company, handled the money, and knew everybody from the county courthouse to the Sunday church picnic. I walked away with an old pickup truck, my grandmother's recipes, and a struggling diner on Main Street that barely paid the electric bill. People whispered that I'd be back asking for help within months. I never was. What nobody in that room understood was that the little diner had become something much bigger than a restaurant. For 8 years, before sunrise and long after sunset, I had quietly built a life that no longer depended on Daniel Walker. Still, I hadn't come to the reunion to prove anything. I came because our daughter begged me to, and because I believed enough time had passed for old wounds to settle. Standing there beneath the school banners, listening to Daniel accuse me in front of people who had known us since childhood, I realized how wrong I'd been. He wasn't interested in remembering the past. He was trying to control it. Then Daniel unfolded the paper in his hand, pointed directly at me and said, "Tell them, Clara, tell them what happened to the money the week before." The bank started investigating. The room fell so quiet that I could hear ice shifting inside the plastic cups on the reunion tables. Daniel stood beneath the faded school banner, the yellowed document trembling slightly in his hand, waiting for me to defend myself. A few classmates exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared at me with the kind of curiosity small towns never quite outgrow. I set my sweet tea on the table beside the family photo albums and took a slow breath. "Well, I'll tell you what," I said, keeping my voice steady. "If you're finally ready to talk about money, let's talk about all of it." Daniel's smile faded for the first time that evening, 8 years earlier, when our divorce became official. Most people believed his version of events. According to him, I had abandoned our marriage and taken money from the family business on my way out. He repeated that story often enough that folks stopped asking questions. What they never knew was that, months before I filed for divorce, I had discovered something hidden inside an old metal toolbox in our garage. Unpaid tax notices, overdue loan statements, and letters from banks I had never heard of. At first, I convinced myself there had to be some mistake. After 43 years of marriage, I wanted to believe that the man I had raised children with was simply overwhelmed. But the more papers I found, the less his explanations made sense. I wasn't born yesterday. One rainy Tuesday, while Daniel was away on a job site, I drove to the county courthouse and paid $20 for copies of public records. I sat alone in my pickup truck afterward, reading page after page while rain tapped against the windshield. That was the day I learned that my family's diner, the same diner my parents had left me, had been used as collateral for loans worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. My signature appeared on every document. The problem was that I had never signed a single one of them. I kept that discovery to myself for weeks. I photocopied bank statements, gathered receipts, and tucked everything into an old recipe box beneath my grandmother's handwritten biscuit instructions. By the time I met with an attorney, I already knew my marriage was over. Daniel had spent years borrowing money to keep his construction company alive, all while telling me that business had never been better. Back in the community center, I looked across the room at the man I had once trusted with my entire life. "You want the truth?" I asked. "Then tell them whose name was on those loans." Daniel opened his mouth, but before he could answer, an elderly man rose from the front row, holding a thick folder against his chest. The moment I recognized him, my stomach dropped. Harold Whitaker, the lawyer who handled our divorce, had just stood up, and judging by the look on his face, He hadn't come to the reunion to reminisce. Harold Whitaker moved slowly down the aisle between the reunion tables, his polished shoes scraping against the wooden floor as whispers spread through the room. I had not seen him in nearly 6 years, not since he retired and sold his law office near the courthouse. Yet there he was, carrying the same worn leather folder I remembered from the divorce. Daniel's face tightened the moment he recognized him. "Harold," he said with a nervous laugh, "I didn't know you were coming. Tonight." The old lawyer ignored the question and stopped a few feet from the stage. "Neither did I," he replied, placing the folder on a table. "My granddaughter invited me this morning." Then he looked directly at Daniel. "But after hearing what you just said, I reckon it's time a few things were cleared up." Nobody sat down. Nobody reached for dessert. 50 classmates stood frozen beneath the school banners, waiting for someone to blink first. Harold opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers held together with a rusted clip. 8 years ago, Mr. Walker accused Clara of taking money from their business account, he said. The court never proved that accusation because the money never went where he claimed. A murmur swept through the room. Daniel shifted his weight but said nothing. Harold removed a bank statement and laid it flat on the table. The funds in question were transferred into a company, registered in neighboring Knox County 6 months. Before the divorce, I frowned. During months of hearings and paperwork, I had never heard about another company. Harold glanced toward me before sliding a second document from the folder. It was a certificate of incorporation with Daniel's signature at the bottom. Beside it was another signature that made my chest tighten. It belonged to my older brother, Robert. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Robert had taught my son to fish. He had sat beside me at our parents' funerals and spent every Thanksgiving on our front porch. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to tell me there had been a mistake. No one spoke. Emily, my daughter, quietly stepped closer and squeezed my hand. "Mom," she whispered. "Did Uncle Robert know?" I could not answer. Harold closed the folder and removed one final item. A sealed envelope with my brother's handwriting across the front. "Robert brought this to my house last week," he said. "He asked me to open it, only if Daniel tried to rewrite the story of that divorce." Daniel suddenly stepped down from the stage. The confidence he had carried all evening was gone. Then Harold handed me the envelope and said words that turned my blood cold. "Clara, your brother claims this reunion wasn't Daniel's idea at all." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, though I did my best not to show it. Around me, the reunion had all but stopped. The brisket outside had gone cold. The class photo had been forgotten. And 50 people who had come to reminisce about football, games, and first dances were now watching my family unravel. Daniel stood near the stage with his arms crossed, staring at the floor. Harold Whitaker adjusted his glasses and took a seat beside my daughter, Emily. I unfolded the letter and immediately recognized my brother. Robert's careful handwriting. "Clara," it began, "by the time you read this, Daniel will probably have already blamed you for things you didn't do. I can't carry my part in this any longer." The room seemed to shrink around me. Robert explained that 10 years earlier, Daniel had persuaded him to invest in a construction company that was already struggling. At first, Robert believed he was helping family. Daniel promised that a few large contracts would turn everything around and that the loans secured against our assets were temporary. But as the debts mounted, Robert discovered that Daniel had begun using my diner, my parents' diner, as collateral. Worse still, several documents carried signatures that Robert knew were not mine. According to the letter, the two men had argued bitterly about it just months before my divorce. Robert refused to witness any more paperwork, and from that day forward, their relationship quietly fell apart. I stopped reading and looked across the room at Daniel. He said nothing. He didn't deny a word. Folks notice more than people think, and the expressions around me had changed. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening were beginning to understand that the story Daniel had told for 8 years was not the truth. I continued reading. Near the end of the letter, Robert admitted that he had spent years carrying the guilt of his silence. He had wanted to come forward during the divorce, but feared losing everything he had worked for. Then came the final paragraph, the reason he had sent Harold to the reunion in the first place. 3 months earlier, Daniel's company had defaulted on its largest loan. The bank had begun foreclosure proceedings, and the company's records were about to become public. Daniel had organized the reunion, not to reconnect with old classmates, But to get ahead of the scandal he knew was coming, he wanted one last chance to paint himself as the victim before the truth. Reached the courthouse. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. The silence in the room was broken only when Emily leaned close and whispered, "Mom, Uncle Robert is outside." Looked toward the doors just as they opened, and the man I hadn't spoken to in nearly 8 years stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase. Every conversation in the room stopped when Robert stepped through the doors of the community center. He looked older than I remembered, thinner too, with deep lines across his face and a leather briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. 8 years of silence is a long time to carry between siblings. Then he walked past the reunion tables, stopped beside Harold Whitaker, and quietly placed the briefcase on the table. "Clara," he said, his voice unsteady, "I should have told the truth a long time ago." Inside were loan agreements, bank records, and copies of contracts that stretched back nearly a decade. Harold sorted through the papers while classmates stood in stunned silence. Piece by piece, the story finally came together. Daniel's construction company had begun failing years before our divorce. But instead of admitting it, he borrowed money against anything he could reach. He forged my signature, used my parents' diner as collateral, and convinced Robert that the business could still be saved if everyone stayed quiet. By the time Robert understood the full extent of the deception, he was trapped by his own investments and too ashamed to come forward. What broke him in the end was the foreclosure notice that arrived 3 months earlier. He knew that once the bank opened its files, the truth would come out anyway. Daniel said very little that night. He sat alone near the stage, staring at the gymnasium floor while old classmates whispered around him. No one shouted at him. No one demanded revenge. They simply saw him differently. The man who had spent years presenting himself as the wronged husband was now exposed by his own records. In the months that followed, the court reopened part of our divorce settlement. The evidence Robert provided cleared my name and forced Daniel to sell most of what remained of his company to cover debts that had been hidden for years. Yet the greatest consequence wasn't financial. It was quieter than that. Friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. People who had once admired him no longer trusted his stories. As for me, I returned to the diner on Main Street. The same little place everyone thought would fail after the divorce. Over the years, I had expanded it into a gathering place for the town, adding a bakery and a small catering business that employed 6 local women who needed a second chance. That was what I had built without Daniel. Not wealth, but a life rooted in honest work and people who cared for one another. A few weeks after the reunion, Robert came by before sunrise. We sat on the porch with coffee, listening to crickets fade as the morning birds woke. After a long silence, he apologized. I told him that some betrayals leave scars, but carrying anger forever only deepens them. Before he left, he looked out toward the gravel road and said, "Character isn't revealed. When life is easy, it shows itself when the truth finally arrives." And after everything that happened, I knew he was right.